Tradition in this community of gathering on or near October 24th, which is the anniversary of the date when the Charter of the United Nations went into effect in 1945. Last evening, Mayor Teague issued a proclamation declaring October 24th to be United Nations Day in Iowa City. And Iowa City mayors have been doing this, once again, since the 1950s or perhaps even earlier. So we're very grateful for that expression of support from Mayor Teague and from the government of Iowa City, and we're grateful to the Iowa City Public Library for hosting the event, for recording it, and making it, therefore, available to even a larger audience. So, this being the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, it seems like a very auspicious landmark in the history of the organization. Our local chapter of the United Nations Association has been conducting a campaign. It's a membership and engagement campaign called 80 for 80, and we've recommended to our members and to the general public various actions that they can take to mark this 80th anniversary. This is a very solemn anniversary. The UN has a commendable record of achievement over 80 years, but as I think we're all well aware, there is also a long unmet agenda of items that must be addressed collectively by governments if there is to be any progress. So as we gather to mark United Nations Day, it's both a time of celebration and recognition of past achievements, but also a time of recommitment to supporting the work as we go forward. One of the basic values of our organization is that governments will act responsibly when the public is informed and vocal. The government of the United States is a charter member of the UN, and now one of the 193 members of the UN. I think we're well aware of the fact that the United States is a charter member, a host to UN headquarters in New York, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a major financial contributor to the UN. And so that gives the United States both a special responsibility and a special opportunity to give constructive leadership in helping the United Nations achieve its goals. And that is basically what our association is attempting to do. We're attempting to show policymakers, decision makers, opinion shapers that whatever they may think, they're actually, as a constituency around the country and here in the heartland, which wants the United States to be a good member of the UN. So, for that purpose, we are circulating an online petition. You've all been importuned as you entered the room today to sign this petition if you have not already. There is the text of the petition. It's very simple, and basically the operative portion is at the end. We call for the strengthening of the partnership between the United States and the United Nations. You can sign this by using the QR code that's on the screen, and at the bottom there is a link. I know that some of us have some difficulty using QR codes, or we have trouble getting that QR code to work properly. So I'm going to send everybody who signed the attendance list today the link so that you can bypass the QR code and use that link to go directly to the petition. So I'd like to invite you either today or when I send the link to sign the petition, and even more, I'd like to encourage you to share it with others. We have these cards that have the QR code. You could pick up a card. One way to mark United Nations Day would be to share this card with other people and encourage them to sign as well. Another thing that you can do is to consider becoming a member of our local chapter. We are the Johnson County affiliate of the United Nations Association of the USA. That is a private, non-governmental, nonpartisan membership organization composed of people who want the United States to be a good member of the UN. And so we're very fortunate to have a large and growing membership here in the county, but we would welcome even more. And this slide suggests why your membership is important. It's an expression of support. It strengthens the work of our national organization in Washington and our local chapter here in Johnson County. And one of the things we do is help to support Model UN students in our local high schools who take part in Model UN conferences, especially one in the Iowa High School Model UN, which is at the University of Northern Iowa every April. The local students are also taking part in an international Model UN, also in the spring, where they will be meeting and working with 100 Chinese students who are coming to Muscatine to take part in this Model UN, which is sponsored by the Stanley, what used to be called the Stanley Foundation, now called the Stanley Center. And what do you get if you're a member? Well, you get lots of information, both from our local chapter and from our national organization. You have the opportunity to attend events, both in person here and online. We provide you with action alerts so that if you want to speak out, and I hope you do, we make it as easy for you as possible. We provide the information and how you can communicate effectively to our members of Congress. If you are a young person, looking out at the audience, I think I'm safe in saying most of you are my age. And that's a wonderful age to be, but if you know young people, if you have a young relative or a young friend, they have opportunities to learn about international affairs, to sharpen their leadership skills, and even to explore international careers. And the organization also provides affinity groups on various topics, but we also believe that this work provides a sense of satisfaction that instead of stewing around and feeling blue about the state of the world, why through UNA you can actually join with others to do something. So I will also be sending that membership link, and I hope you will consider joining. High school age students can join for free. College age and young professional people can join at a reduced fee, and so those are special opportunities for the next generation. Now, speaking of the next generation, I'm pleased to show you a very short video that was made by one of our youth members. I hope I
is Lula Rondred, and I'm a senior at the University of Iowa. I joined the Johnson County United Nations Association because I believe our generation has a responsibility to shape the future that we want to see. The United Nations works towards a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, and where global connections lead to shared progress. Supporting U.S. engagement in the UN ensures that our country has a say in global issues, so that we may lead with our values and strengthen our international relationships. By getting involved in my local chapter, I'm taking action to make a difference right here in my community. Please go to unausa.org to learn more.
So I hope with that encouragement from one of our young members that you or people you know, if you're already a current member, you could do something for UN Day by recruiting another member. So I hope you'll take that invitation to membership seriously. I'm sure you will. Now, I've talked for too long, and I know you're all very eager, as I am, to hear Lisa Heineman, and so I'm going to call on Barbara Eckstein, who is the president of our chapter, and she will introduce our speaker. But thank you again.
Hello. You've heard from Jim that our organization's purpose is to educate about and advocate for the work of the United Nations. Part of that work, as he mentioned, involves traveling to Washington, D.C. to speak as a nonpartisan organization to our members of Congress about United States engagement with and funding of the United Nations. This past summer, during our delegation's meeting with Representative Miller Meeks, she closed an otherwise cordial conversation with the claim that the United Nations is anti-Semitic and opposed to Western cultural values. When we JCUNA board members at home in Johnson County heard this claim, we knew that it needed to be addressed in a public forum about the history and diverse uses of the word anti-Semitic. So here we are today, commemorating UN Day in this public forum on understanding anti-Semitism. We'll leave the claim about anti-Western cultural values for another day. We're fortunate to have Professor Lisa Heineman nearby at the University of Iowa to help us understand anti-Semitism. She's a professor of German and European studies within the Department of History, as well as of gender and sexuality and of human rights. Among the courses she offers are the Holocaust in History and Memory, readings in the history of human rights, as well as Jews, Judaism, and social justice. A scholar of note in both the U.S. and Germany, Professor Heineman is generous with her knowledge, often sharing it in the public sphere. We are most grateful that she will be doing that today.
Thank you, everybody. Let me just change which slideshow we're looking at. And if you can't hear me, wave your arms around and I'll get closer to the mic. Hold on a sec. Here we go, look at that. And how do I get full screen? Like that. Okay, so thank you so much to the Johnson County chapter of the United Nations Association for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor on the 80th anniversary of the Charter of the United Nations, and thank you also to ICPL, to the Public Library, for making their facility available, for taking care of tech issues, and eventually, I'm not sure if I should be grateful for putting it on YouTube where it will live forever. So I want to start out, let me just take a look at the time real quick. Okay. You know, we often want to start a discussion like this with some basic facts and figures. What's a definition of anti-Semitism? What kind of, how prevalent is it? I'm not actually going to do that because definitions and data have become political footballs. So instead, I'm going to do what we call an education. I'm going to teach the controversy. I will eventually get to definitions and data if you want. Okay. But here's something we do know. Anti-Semitism has historically been an extraordinarily destructive force, going all the way back to medieval Europe and constant expulsions and massacres, to somewhere in the many tens of thousands dead in the mid-17th century due to pogroms in Ukraine, to the pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th century in Russia, including in the Russian Civil War, where it's estimated that there were 100,000 Jewish deaths in pogroms, and of course, all the way to the Holocaust with its 6 million dead. This is a persistent problem, and it is truly devastating. Today, in our very polarized moment, with sadly routine access to violence, we see events like the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that left 11 fatalities, all the way to the attack on the Manchester, England synagogue just about a month ago that left 2 dead, and in addition to the perpetrator. We also see today accusations of anti-Semitism being used to stifle political dissent. And what I want to talk about today is how we get there, how we have a world in which simultaneously anti-Semitism is real and can be quite violent and deadly, and at the same time, discussion of anti-Semitism can be used to quash other kinds of political speech. So to give a super quick overview, I'm going to give a couple of frameworks for thinking about anti-Semitism. I'm going to talk a little bit about history. Don't get me started. I am a historian. I can talk to you until I retire about this subject. I'm going to try to keep it brief. I'm going to spend most of my time on issues regarding today's environment and how to interpret some of the major issues that we see around us. And then I want to close with a few thoughts about ways forward. So let me start with two significant frameworks for thinking about anti-Semitism. And these aren't scholarly, well, I guess they appear in the scholarship, but more important, they are part of kind of subconscious popular discourse, unarticulated popular discourse. One is what I call the oldest hatred framework. This notion that anti-Semitism has been around forever, it's eternal, it's inevitable, it is sui generis, it's absolutely unique, there's nothing quite like it. And as such, it's just there forever. It might take different forms, but it's just there, and you'll never get rid of it. It's going to morph, okay? I don't care for this framework. In my mind, this notion of inevitability, the fact that it's always there, means there's no real point towards working towards a world without anti-Semitism. All you could do is build walls against it, okay? It leads to a sense of isolation, a sense that you can't really trust anybody else. You can't really feel safe, even when things are going magnificently for Jews, right? It leads to a sense of hypervigilance. Any crack in the facade might indicate a Holocaust in the making, right? It could lead to a kind of a hypervigilance. It also, in my mind, removes agency from the perpetrators of anti-Semitic acts. It basically says, listen, this is an inevitable force, it's eternal. The people who are perpetrating it are playing their role in what's an eternal story. I would rather hold perpetrators accountable by situating them in a particular setting, by having them be decision makers in a particular setting. The second framework, which obviously is the one I prefer, is to understand anti-Semitism as an historical, a political, a sociological phenomenon that's situated in human society, and human societies change enormously. In this framework, I should say, I'm going to put out the claim that anti-Semitism is unique, but it's not unique in its uniqueness. Every form of bias, every social hierarchy, every form of identity-based harm has its own particular history, its own particular sociology, its own forms of expression, its own impact, right? So our challenge is to understand what is specific to anti-Semitism, what is unique about it, and embed that discussion in a larger understanding of bias, okay, both historically and today. Now, let's jump to history a little bit. When we think about anti-Semitism as being eternal, oldest hatred, inevitable, it just keeps changing its forms, but it's always there, we are not actually talking about global history. We're talking about Europe. Okay, we're talking about Europe. There has been a tendency in education from K through 12 to university to kind of conflate the history of the West with world history, to sort of universalize it. That becomes a problem in thinking about anti-Semitism. Since we often conflate Western history, we sort of universalize it. Many people have tended to understand this as a universal history rather than a specific history. So I want to narrow it down a little bit to kind of, I was not aware, okay, heads up, I was not aware of that conversation with Mariette Miller Meeks. But I'm going there, it turns out. But but possibly in a way that would challenge a little bit what she said, in that I am going to situate anti-Semitism specifically in that tradition, okay? Starting with the early competition between early emergent Christianity and the Judaism of its day, where both sides felt a need to differentiate themselves from the other. But in fact, Christianity emerges triumphant. Obviously, Judaism survives, but Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. It becomes the basis for medieval Europe and so on and so forth. And so we have, for example, the Latin term, right, current in the early days of, I don't speak fluent Latin, not sure anyone does, but odium Judaeorum, the notion of Jews' odiousness, right? As moved to medieval Europe and people stopped speaking Latin, the German term Judenhass becomes current, meaning Jew hatred, hostility towards Jews, okay? This becomes part of the foundations of, and of course this is a very long history, of what is going to become, in a sense, Christian-dominated Europe. And Christians are the overwhelming majority in Europe. There's maybe between 1% and 2% Jews in Europe at any given time during this long history. In the 19th century, Europe modernizes. We still have a vast majority of Christians in Europe, but increasingly they're saying, hey, listen, we need to pay attention to science. We can't take the Bible literally. Some of the traditional ways of speaking about religion started to feel superstitious to a lot of people in light of new scientific knowledge. And so a new term is coined in Germany, anti-Semitism. And the purpose of that term was to take this old bias, this old prejudice, and make it feel modern, make it feel scientific. And what modern and scientific meant was based on claims of biological racism. Okay? So the idea here is that Jews are a particular race in the understanding that Europeans of the time had. And as such, they were foreign elements, right? Now, both of these frameworks could then continue to exist side by side. You don't have an instant replacement. You have rather kind of a compatibility. Really significantly, both frameworks made claims of inevitable and eternal and incredibly powerful truths in explaining the world. Whether it's a theological claim of the eternal battle of good versus evil, that's really big, right? Or whether it's a kind of scientific claim of racial determinism, okay? Both of these really create a kind of a very fixed category of Jews that's not going to change, right? They are agents of the devil. They are a specific race that has specific characteristics, right? Now, in the meantime, it's been many people now reject that notion of the kind of inevitability or eternal perfidy or degeneracy of Jews, right? This is not something that everybody adheres to anymore, except for people who are in certain strands of anti-Semitic thought. However, this notion of something that's eternal and inevitable has lingered in many people's understanding of anti-Semitism. That is the notion that anti-Semitism is eternal and inevitable, right? Because this experience of anti-Semitism, it's changing definitions, but it's continual over centuries, over millennia, impact on European Jews, you end up with this kind of language of inevitability feeling very real, okay? We have the opportunity to think beyond that, to dispose of the notion of inevitability or, eternalness, either for the nature of Jews or for the existence of anti-Semitism. We can think beyond that framework, and that's what I want to encourage us to do. First, let me say a couple more words, though, about that legacy, because it continues to matter. Both theological and racial anti-Semitism in this context had a practice of scapegoating Jews for broader challenges. Jews are responsible for the bubonic plague, right? Jews are responsible for the inequities of capitalism. Jews are responsible for the threat of communism, right? So it became a kind of an amorphous, all-purpose kind of accusation, which is part of what lent to, aided the notion that it's kind of always there, it just changes its face. Significantly, the accusation against Jews is one of moral degeneracy, which might be revealed by grotesque physical features, right? But the accusation is not inferior intelligence. And this is a significant thing that differentiated what I'm going to continue to call anti-Semitism from many other forms of bias. So, for example, bias against colonial subjects often presumed lower intelligence, right? In the case of Jews, according to anti-Semites, it was precisely this combination of high intelligence with moral corruption that made Jews dangerous, right? Jews, as morally degenerate but intelligent people, had very wily ways to literally do the work of the devil or to manipulate financial markets, right? And this wily, immoral intelligence also enabled Jews to sort of form secret conspiracies that had global impact to harm others. Okay, and we moved away to this conspiracy theory. Let me just sort of quickly show you a slide of some of these forms, right? We have here the kind of Christian accusation of mutilating Christian children to take their blood for Jewish ritual purposes, right? This is a sort of has nothing to do with actual Jewish ritual practice whatsoever. It is out and out libel. But it was a very common notion taught in many medieval Christian settings that Jews killed Christian children to get their blood to use for ritual purposes, right? This is clearly the devil's work, right? And then we have something like this one, the one on the top right, Embracing the Globe. This is a caricature that emerges from that emerges from accusations against the Rothschild family, the Rothschild family, Jewish European financiers in the 19th century. Actually, they had a very long history. But the notion that this wealthy Jew is grasping the whole globe, right? And then, of course, direct heir to that kind of image is the image of George Soros, with octopus tentacles grasping the globe in the lower right, right? So these kinds of images of conspiracy that really cause harm to others. Obviously, this European antipathy towards Jews, whatever, whether it's religious, whether it's racial, in its terminology, found expression in everything from discriminatory legislation, where you can or can't live, what trades you can practice, all the way to mass killings and genocide, right? This is an extraordinarily harmful force. After the Holocaust, after World War II, the locus of Jewish life shifts. From Europe, where prior to the Holocaust, about 2/3 of the world's Jews had lived, there aren't very many Jews left in Europe after the Holocaust. The locus of Jewish life shifts to two poles, the United States and Israel, okay? So we need to move into that reality. The European legacy is going to continue to be important in both of those places. Both of those states essentially emerged from Europe in one way or another, right? So that legacy continues to be very important. At the same time, there are radically new contexts, okay? In the United States, post-World War II, you're talking about a multiracial, religiously diverse environment that is built on the principles, the liberal principles of civic equality. And at this moment, in the post-war years, this is a few decades that are characterized by the civil rights movement, the movement for Chicano rights, feminism, all kinds of movements that are about really expanding the promise of liberal democracy. So the language is very much about the sort of multiracial, religiously diverse, and so on and so forth, democracy. It is obviously a struggle, but that is the discussion that's being had. It's a very different framework. In Israel, of course, you have also a very different framework, and that is a sovereign Jewish state that has the various tools of power that a state possesses, like a military, diplomatic channels, right? Like abilities to, in some ways, manage an economy, right? So these are two very different contexts than the prior European context. All right, I'm going to focus for the rest of today on the United States rather than Israel, although the question of responses to Israel is obviously very important in the American case as well. I want to articulate 3 different kinds of anti-Semitism that are useful for thinking about expressions of anti-Semitism in the world we live in. Post-war, and post-war is a pretty long time by now, but still, it matters. It matters because that's a closer legacy than, say, medieval Europe. Okay, first is narrative anti-Semitism. And by narrative anti-Semitism, I mean broadly internalized stereotypes that may not result in any direct harm or any kind of action, but may be tapped by a leader or a political movement to mobilize people who feel vulnerable, to identify a supposed threat, right? So that kind of narrative anti-Semitism, the fact that stereotypes do exist and can be tapped. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is structural anti-Semitism. Best known in the European context against Nazi racial laws are an example of this. Older European laws saying, for example, that Jews may not own property or may not enter certain trades. In the American context, until till the post-war period, you did have structural anti-Semitism in the form of differential legal rights. You didn't have laws saying Jews may or may not do this. But what you did have, you also didn't have laws prohibiting private actors from discriminating. So, for example, you'll have housing covenants that bar the sale of property to Jews. You have university quotas on the percentage of Jews or the number of Jews that can enter a particular university. It is legal to run employment ads in the classified section of the newspaper that say Christians only, right? That stuff is legal, okay, until you move towards, really into the civil rights era and the civil rights legislation that, broadly speaking, addresses all these things. So that's structural anti-Semitism. We don't really have that in the United States at this juncture. We don't really have that. And then there's what I'm going to call functional anti-Semitism. And that is harmful acts outside the law, outside legal frameworks, but not just sort of hidden biases. So, for example, actual acts, anywhere from, say, social exclusion based on a Jewish-sounding name, right, all the way to violent attacks. Okay, that's what I'm going to call functional anti-Semitism. We also often talk about anti-Semitism on the right and anti-Semitism on the left. Right anti-Semitism, left anti-Semitism. Right anti-Semitism tends to echo what I've described as some of those older variants. Religious and racial grounds very often, or religious and racial language used. It often goes hand in hand, it typically goes hand in hand with other racial and religious biases. For example, color-based racism or Islamophobia. In other words, right anti-Semitism today, as it's emerged in the last few decades, tends to basically take a form of white Christian nationalism or white Christian supremacy. Now, I want to underscore here that I'm talking about an ideology, not a personal identity. You could be white and Christian without being a white Christian supremacist. I'm talking about an ideology, however, that is very real. Data supports the alignment of these biases. So, for example, we see anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Semitic acts rising and falling historically in the United States together with racist acts and racist biases, right? So these things tend to rise and fall in synchronicity with each other in the United States. There is also, however, even aside from this fact that there's some alignment here, there is also an aspect of uniqueness in anti-Semitism in this setting. And here, a framework by scholar Eric Ward, who is also a very effective activist and organizer, is really helpful. He's a nationally recognized expert on the relationships among authoritarian movements, hate-based violence, and efforts to preserve inclusive democracy. And to put it in shorthand, what Eric Ward says is, if in white supremacists' minds, people of color are so inferior, how are they so threatening? Right? How are they so threatening? Well, he continues in his analysis, they are so threatening according to this particular ideology, because Jews are the ones actually pushing the buttons in the background. Okay? It's something that basically creates a framework for, in a sense, minimizing the agency of black and brown actors who might have their own interests in changing the system, in liberation. But it also makes Jews kind of the puppet masters of this troubling behavior. So, for example, and we see this, we've seen this recently, the Pittsburgh shooter in 2018, right? Left documentation indicating that he believed that Jews were behind the surge of immigration on the southern border, right? He railed against the Hebrew Immigrant Highest. Thank you. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, thank you, yeah, which he said was really organizing this influx of black and brown immigrants over the southern border. This is a very powerful framework, right? In Charlottesville, at the Charlottesville March in 2017, right, many of us will remember the chant, "Jews will not replace us." At first hearing, it might mean, you might think it means, well, Jews, here I am, a Christian, a Jew's not going to come and replace me, right? There aren't that many Jews. I'm just going to tell you that right now. What it really means is Jews will not replace us with people of color. Jews will not replace us with immigrants, okay? Jews will not replace us with Muslims, okay? Replacement theory, okay? This is not only a real ideology, but it's one that in recent years has had deadly impact, okay? Now, how about left anti-Semitism? How about what we call anti-Semitism on the left? Here, what's often referred to as anti-Semitism on the left is more often linked to opposition to Zionism, opposition to the state of Israel. And this, of course, opens up the question of the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, the relationship between Jews, all Jews as a category, and the state of Israel. And for this, we need more history. Okay? Let me talk a little bit about sort of just a super big historical overview of the relationship between Jews and Zionism, Jews and the state of Israel. I want to say something about the word Zionism first. Like the word anti-Semitism, it emerged at a very particular moment, in a very particular context, in fact, roughly the same time as the word anti-Semitism, right? It is part of the tensions of modernity, and a number of things that students in my history classes learn all about. The word also has meant a lot of different things. Just like there's lots of different varieties of liberalism, there's lots of different forms of conservatism, there's lots of different versions of Zionism, okay? The origins of political Zionism really have to do with a phenomenon in 19th century Europe where people started to organize around nation states, the notion of Germany for the Germans, right? Hungary for the Hungarians, Poland for the Poles. Not all of these states actually existed at the time, but there are strivings. The notion that various peoples, nations, shouldn't be under other people, but rather should have their own country. Once people started identifying themselves that way, I am a Hungarian, I am a Pole, Jews didn't belong to any of those categories. Jews were actually excluded from, they were understood not only as a religion, but as a nation, as a nationality, as an ethnicity, sometimes the way we would talk about it. This left Jews in Europe thinking, boy, if this is the organization of states, we're not going to fit in anywhere, this is bad news. We need to have our own nationalism. We need to have a Jewish state for the Jews. And then you have a long history that has a lot of twists and turns. It's not a simple road, but you move towards political Zionism. Today, for my shorthand, Zionism means support for the state of Israel. In functional terms today, that's what people usually mean by Zionist. Anti-Zionist means opposition to the state of Israel or its actions. Now, people who claim either one of those labels will give you much more nuanced descriptions of what they're all about, right? And of course, again, these aren't super simple concepts, but again, in the vernacular today, that's how they're typically understood. When political Zionism originated in the late 19th century, most Jews opposed it. Okay, they opposed it for one of many reasons. Some of them opposed it on religious grounds. It wasn't up to people, to Jews, to organize politically to create a Jewish state. That was supposed to be God's work in the Messianic age. So there's a and many religious Jews did not thought that Zionism was actually kind of sacrilege. On liberal grounds, many Jews opposed it. They thought that the way to go was to insist on equal citizenship wherever they happened to be, right? Equality wherever they happened to be, rather than a sort of separate citizenship for each national group. And connected with this are the fears that Zionism would actually feed anti-Semitism, right? It would kind of suggest that Jews themselves were saying, we don't really belong here, wherever we are. We don't really belong in Germany, right? You don't really have to integrate us. You don't really have to accept us, because actually we belong somewhere else. We belong in our own country. So there's a real concern that Zionism would inflame anti-Semitism. After the Holocaust, after the foundation of the State of Israel, of course, I'm going to move now to the United States as my key location here. Israeli statehood felt like something like a miracle after the Holocaust. Only 3 years after the Holocaust. Most American Jews had come over only 1 or 2 generations earlier from Europe. They had left parents, grandparents, cousins behind, right? American Jews were personally affected by the Holocaust, even if they themselves had got out early enough. But it felt like a miracle over there. The Holocaust mattered to them, but luckily they were in this other place. And this miracle of Israeli statehood mattered, but it was also over there. There wasn't exactly a flight of American Jews to go over to the State of Israel, because they wanted to be where they were. And they were very concerned. The central concern was really full participation in American life. This is when those various barriers were dropping, right? University quotas and all that kind of stuff. This is when the immigrant generation, which had often been quite poor, saw their kids graduate from university and go on to have really nice economic opportunities during the boom years of the post-war economy, right? So there's a lot to be said for saying we're investing in ourselves right here, and we're in a world that really seems to value discussions about full civic personhood, full civic participation. During this era, major Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, which actually had started its activity before the Second World War, but organizations like the Anti-Defamation League were deeply involved in the broader civil rights agenda, okay? Seeing it as a very American project that American Jews should be part of. Okay, jump ahead a couple decades to the Six-Day War in 1967. With that war, the Six-Day War in 1967, which is what brought the occupation of the current occupied territories, but that's not what impacted Jews in the United States so much. What impacted Jews in the United States was the sense that this had been kind of another miraculous event, that Israel had been under existential threat, but that it had emerged triumphant. Not only triumphant, but in fact occupying additional territories without being able to look into the future and understand what that was going to mean, okay? Remind my students that people in the past could not look into the future. But simultaneously, so first of all, the sense that, whoa, Israel had actually been in real danger, so maybe more investment in that emotionally. And also, as we move to the late 60s, 1970s, a rise of identitarian politics in the United States. Sort of ethnic pride of whatever kind. So there's a kind of an emotive shift in the late 60s, 70s. In the 1980s, you start to see important things happening in institutional life, institutional Jewish life. A shift of key institution towards pro-Israel politics, linked with an emphasis on the dangers of anti-Semitism. The 1980s is really when AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, exploded in importance. It is not, by the way, a Jewish organization. It's a pro-Israel lobbying group. However, it overlaps in significant ways with powerful institutions in the Jewish community. The 1980s is really when you see the AIPAC become an immense powerhouse. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is going to begin its shift from a broad civil rights agenda to a much narrower focus on anti-Semitism and Israel advocacy. And this is the era that really cements the notion of the Jewish lobby, and the association of pro-Israel politics and the Jewish lobby with money in politics, okay? It needs to be said that many other groups also had advocacy groups, had lobbying groups. I often think about the outsized influence, for example, of the Cuban refugee community in Florida, right? Their outsized influence in American politics, because they have very particular interests connected with their own history and ongoing concerns about Cuba. So this is not a uniquely Jewish thing. This is the structure of American politics. It rewards creating lobbying groups, and it rewards having an influence in politics in that way. That's one shift. The other shift, institutional shift I want to note here, is a shift in Jewish education towards an emphasis on Israel education and Holocaust education, right? Both of which, of course, had been real before, but increasingly Jewish education and socialization comes to really focus more and more on the Holocaust and implicitly the broader threat of anti-Semitism and the necessity of the Israeli state. And what you have as a result, this is in Hebrew schools, in day schools, in summer camps, and so on and so forth, a couple generations of kids who, growing up in Jewish institutions, learn that what it means to be Jewish is to really recognize the eternal threat of anti-Semitism and to identify very closely with the state of Israel. Now, if you think of this starting in the 1980s or so, people who were socialized in the 80s are very advanced in their careers now. Right? So the socialization has had a really profound impact in institutional Jewish life. There are significant limits to a focus on institutions, okay? It doesn't tell you necessarily much about people who aren't really involved in the institutions or people who are tangentially involved. They write a check once a year, but basically their life is about other things, right? But institutions do matter, so it's important to note that. Now, American support for Israel is not only or even mainly Jewish. Jews constitute less than 2% of the American population, and despite what anti-Semites might say, Jews do not have the power to bend other people to act against their own interests for their own, for their own success. This Jewish population could not possibly pull off America's relationship to Israel today. There are many other factors explaining the United States' traditional closeness to the state of Israel. The United States has military, diplomatic, economic interests, okay, in Israel, right? A lot of just kind of plain old diplomatic stuff. There is widespread Islamophobia, racism, anti-Arab prejudice that can translate into seeing Israel as a kind of a bulwark of kind of an extension of that European legacy, right? And it's sort of an American footprint there. And there is also very significantly the impact of Christian Zionism among the evangelical base of the Republican Party. I should say that the largest Christian Zionist organization, Christians United for Israel, is a membership organization. It has more members. This one organization has more members than there are Jews in the United States. Okay, we really can't underplay that factor. It's a very significant portion, of the kind of political language. All of this friendship with Israel, for various reasons, whether it's military and economic, whether it's theological, whether it's about kind of Islamophobia, all of that is compatible with anti-Semitism, right? Christian Zionism can really favor support for the state of Israel as part of a theology of the end of days, and at the same time take for granted that Jews' fate at the end of days is going to be immense suffering and death and eternal damnation, right? It is very possible to feel that you have an economic interest in the Middle East and at the same time assume that Jews have an outside role in the economy, right? None of these reasons for being pro-Israel are incompatible with anti-Semitism. This is a somewhat older story. Being hawkish on Israel does not equal being a friend of the Jews, but it's often conflated with it publicly. I'm a friend of the Jews, I support the state of Israel. I'm a friend of the Jews, I support this bill for military support for the state of Israel. That language is there. What is a newer story, really, that people have noticed sort of in alarming fashion over the last couple of years, is an addition to that of domestic priorities. The notion that repression of speech, an attack on universities, and so on and so forth, equals being a friend to the Jews. Okay? How do we understand this strange phenomenon of people with anti-Semitic attitudes privileging Jews? It's important to understand that philo-Semitism, the love of Jews, and anti-Semitism are not contradictory. They are entirely compatible. Philo-Semitism basically it still singles out Jews as a special category, as a very particular category, not like the rest of us, okay? Now, you might have, as many Christians do, have a sense that, wow, Jesus was a Jew. That means Jews are important to me, right? But that kind of specialness can also very easily lead to weird places. Discrimination does not express itself only by straight-out oppression or violence. There are other ways to single out a group. And I want to quote here Aurora Levins Morales, who is a Puerto Rican Jewish artist and writer, because she puts this really nicely. She says that anti-Semitism can function to create a vulnerable buffer group that can be bribed with some privileges into managing the exploitation of others, and then, when social pressure builds, be blamed and scapegoated, distracting those at the bottom from the crimes of the top. Peasants who go on a pogrom against their Jewish neighbors won't make it to the nobleman's palace to burn him out and seize the fields. What's so great about this quote is the way that she jumps from this kind of abstract formulation to suddenly she's talking about peasants in the fields and the reason this is great is that if Jewish history is part of your vernacular, never mind if you're a deep student of it, you understand that leap. And basically this reminds you that we have seen this movie before. We have seen this movie before. She's pointing to something very historical and very real. It's a reference to a significant era in Jewish history where Jews are pushed out of many spots in Europe. They are welcomed by many powerful figures in Eastern Europe to take on a specific role. Again, Jews are under duress. They need to find a place to go. What's more, they're excluded from many trades. They're excluded from living in many areas. They're excluded from owning land. So it's kind of hard to make a living, right? So here you have now powerful people saying, you can come here, and I have a job for you, and that job is rent collector. So rather than me or my son going around to the peasants saying, yeah, I know you're starving, but give me your rent anyway, you get that nice task, right? With the effect being that the people that peasants dread is not the nobleman, but rather the Jewish rent collector. This is systemic. It is saving Jews from precarious situations that they might be fleeing from. It's giving them a job that's better than being a peasant, frankly, right? But it's also putting them at risk for when the peasants finally get sick of the whole system. Okay? So that's what she's doing here. When I say we've seen this movie before, the analysis that people are, that scholars are giving for what we're seeing today is powerful forces tapping Jewish fears of anti-Semitism, right, that are real, offering them the privilege of special protection in order to crush universities, to push back the gains of the civil rights era, to suppress political speech, and so on, all the while making it tempting for those who were losing out in all of that to blame Jews for their evident advantage. Okay? Jews recognize this. There were a whole bunch of polls. For some reason, last May was a big polling month. I'm not sure why. But a whole bunch of independent polls by different agencies polled Jewish voters last May, pretty recent. And either a majority of like 49% or an outright plurality of Jewish voters in all of these polls felt that actions against higher ed increased anti-Semitism. Felt that the deportation, the arrest and deportation of pro-Palestinian protesters increased anti-Semitism, right? It felt pretty easy to see the dangers of this approach for Jews, that it was not about being friendly towards Jews, but it was rather about achieving other ends, like getting the rent from the peasants, but doing it in a way that would create a separate scapegoat. And so we end up with special protections against speech perceived as anti-Semitic, simultaneously with the elimination of constitutional protections of free speech in the case of, for example, teaching about Black history, right? It's not only that these things coordinate, they're put in direct opposition to each other. We also end up with very specific, in the current environment, the right now, the right here, the right now, very specific and targeted attacks on Palestinians and their supporters. And just as we see often a conflation of the acts of Israel and Zionism with Jews as a group, we see very often a conflation of the notion of violent terrorism, extremism with Muslims writ large, right? With Palestinians writ large. So we see both kinds of conflations happening at the same time. When there are outbreaks of violence between Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territories, in southern Lebanon, what have you, when there are outbreaks of violence, anti-Semitism, as best as we can tell by our very imperfect data, anti-Semitism rises. And when there are outbreaks of violence between Israel and Palestinians or Israel and Arab neighbors, Islamophobic attacks increase. Attacks on people with Arabic surnames or first Arabic names increases. Both of these things, again, they're moving together. In our current environment, though, the dominant response has been to say we must protect Jews from anti-Semitic speech, but not the parallel for speech that might be harmful to Muslims, to Arabs, to Palestinians. In fact, the opposite, right? As pro-Palestinian speech is designated as anti-Semitic, okay? All of this in the name of protecting Jews from supposed anti-Semitism, but in fact, creating additional tensions, creating additional dangers, creating a sense that somehow the Jews are the privileged class in all of this. And in the meantime, civil rights are being dismantled, right? Universities are being stripped of funding for very excellent research. Actually, let me see how we're doing with time. We're doing okay. I'm going to just show you a tiny bit of the local story. The data is terrible. I will say data on anti-Semitic stuff is terrible. Usually when there are news reports about how, whether anti-Semitism is rising or falling, usually the source is the Anti-Defamation League, which has methods of collecting data that no social scientist would approve of. I mean, there are methodologies for collecting data. The ADL, however, has data, and of course it is very, if you're running a story, you want numbers. You want numbers, and the ADL makes data available. There are a number of ways in which it's methodologically problematic, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if you're so inclined. But I figured there are a couple of researchers really did a deep dive into the ADL data in 2023, and they just got every single case report. And they were kind enough to share the Iowa reports with me. You ready? So let's look at anti-Semitism in the state of Iowa and realize that reports from the ADL are often used to sort of say, look how much anti-Semitism is increasing, look how bad it is. All right, here we are, Iowa, 2023, the ADL data. Before October 7th, 9 incidents. A Senate subcommittee meeting was Zoom bombed by an individual who has displayed a swastika. These are examples. The words, "God hates fags and Jews," were painted at a park. A car driving in a public area features SS Bolt bumper stickers, and individuals associated with the anti-Semitic Goyim Defense League distributed propaganda in a residential area, which stated every single aspect of the media is Jewish, and every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. Two things to note here. One is that these fall into the category of right anti-Semitism, right, linking together hatred of queer people with hatred of Jews, linking together the media with somehow Jewish power, linking COVID measures with Jews. And then, of course, some of them are really quite small, you know, a bumper sticker. I don't love bumper stickers with SS bolts. Whether they constitute a real threat to me, I think, is a different story. This is one of the issues. Again, it's worth noting that such bumper stickers exist, but one of the issues with the ADL data is no weighting. No weighting. That is, that bumper sticker is one incidence, and a shooting at a synagogue is one incident. Okay, so that's one of the methodological issues. After October 7th, there are 8 incidents, all of which I've effectively listed here. The first one, at an anti-Israel rally, a protester held signs with messages such as "resistance against occupation is a human right." You see, essentially, that's 6 times, okay? One of those also includes some of the speakers said things like blah, 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 blah. So it's a little bit longer. Very harsh words about Israel, nothing specifically about Jews as such. And then Iowa City, a city council meeting was disrupted by an individual associated with the anti-Semitic city council death squad who made anti-Semitic comments. And then in December, a synagogue targeted with an anti-Semitic bomb threat. Okay, so this is what we're talking about when you sort of see references to ADL data. Obviously, if you go at the national level, you will find a certain number of truly dangerous and truly serious incidents, no question about that. But I want to give you a sense of what we see at the local level. All right, what should we do? How do we work to combat anti-Semitism? Again, as a reminder, there are 2 models. If you basically hold that anti-Semitism is eternal, it's singular, it has always existed and always will, there's not much you can do. You're not going to find real friends, people who will be your friends in the long haul. You just never know when something's going to turn on you. All you could do is defend against it, rely on walls, rely on military superiority, suppression of speech. You can err on the side of hypervigilance. This seems to me like an unpromising approach. Okay? If we see anti-Semitism as part of a larger phenomenon of bias, privilege, exclusion, that shows different faces depending on the political context, the cultural context, the social context, and so on, then we can develop some strategies because these things are context specific. First of all, I would say we can resist marriages of convenience with known anti-Semites or authoritarians because you fear threatening speech. Okay, we can resist those marriages of convenience. We can work with allies to address intersecting systems of bias, understanding and acknowledging that they don't all look the same. They don't all function the same way, okay? The test is not, does your discrimination look exactly the same as my discrimination, but rather these are interlocking and interwoven and serve different functions, okay? Keep in mind that for anti-Semites, right, as we see, for example, with the replacement theory stuff, these things are linked. Jews play one role, immigrants play a different role, but they are all part of the same system. So if we can start with that and say, listen, our oppression doesn't have to look the same, but they're connected. We need to talk about them together. That's important. We also need to work with allies to address our own biases, to wrestle honestly with issues like racism and anti-Semitism among people who are threatened by these same pressures of rising authoritarianism. Black Lives Matter movement very much challenged white allies to grapple with their own unconscious bias and white privilege. We can ask Jews, as a necessity for forming healthy alliances, to grapple with areas in which they may have privilege or internalized biases, okay? Having been subjected to discrimination and even genocide in the past does not inoculate one against bigotry, right? So facing that and sort of thinking, okay, in the here and now, what are the systems we're dealing with? For white Jews, for example, rising status did involve adopting the privileges of whiteness, which came at other people's expense, right? So coming to terms with that. We can also ask non-Jewish allies to grapple with internalized anti-Semitism. No one is immune from bias, including in Palestinian solidarity circles. And again, I want to remind us of some of the common claims that do conflate Israel and Jews. Israel claims to speak for all Jews worldwide. Many American Jewish institutions have insisted that closeness to Israel is incontrovertibly part of Jewish identity, right? Christian Zionists and most of our political establishment hold that pro-Israel policies are the same as being friendly towards Jews. All of these things are incorrect, but they have been stated very loudly for decades. And so it might be understandable when President Biden says things like, were there no Israel, there wouldn't be a Jew in the world that is safe, right? It is incorrect, and in fact, for many, it feels obnoxious. Wait a second, you're not going to protect us here, right? You know, but you can also see with certain kinds of language floating around the atmosphere for decades and decades, how it becomes possible to conflate things. If a president can absorb this conflation, so can people who have suffered at the hands of the state of Israel, right? It is possible to err in conflating Israel's actions with the attitudes of Jews more broadly. This is something we have to dismantle. It's going to take work, right? This stuff is super not easy. It is super not easy. There are long histories behind all of this, and there's a very complex environment today. So get prepared for some hard work. Here's my wish. My wish is that, starting with the focus of our talk today, we understand that anti-Semitism is real, that it poses very real harms to Jews, and it poses very real threats to other people, both in the ways that anti-Jewish animus is sometimes conflated with, again, the replacement theory stuff, this notion that anti-Semitism is about Jews being in control, and what they do to exercise that control is they make people of color or immigrants, they raise them up in ways that threaten what some people would consider their America. Okay? That is one way in which anti-Semitism threatens others, and today, the instrumentalization of fears of anti-Semitism for other purposes, such as rolling back civil rights gains, is also very dangerous to non-Jews. My wish is that we work to combat anti-Semitism with grace at the personal level, knowing that bias can be absorbed unconsciously from very powerful cultural currents. With grace, knowing that addressing bias is best approached by friendship, collaboration, working together, difficult conversations in love, by calling in and not just calling out. And my wish is that at the same time, we work to combat anti-Semitism with all urgency at the level of policy, of public discourse, and the task of remedying harms caused both by anti-Semitism and by its instrumentalization to damage other vulnerable people, and its instrumentalization to undermine liberal democracy. I would love to open the floor to comments and questions, and thank you so much for your attention all this time. For those who have questions, there will be a floating microphone. Since this is being recorded, it's helpful if you can speak into the microphone. So go ahead, raise your hand if you've got something on your mind.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Can you clarify, what is Christian Zionism then?
Christian Zionism, first thing I'm going to say is it's a lot of things. because that's what I do. I'm a professor of the humanities. Okay, but Christian Zionism emerges in Europe in this world in which there's a lot of thinking that Jews really don't have a place in Christendom, in Christian society. And so it makes sense maybe for Jews to go have a separate place. That's a sort of a 19th century version, right? It is an anti-Semitic, it has anti-Semitic origins. Jews don't belong here in Christian Europe, but maybe they should have a separate place. It then gets increasingly entangled with theology, with a particular strand of Christian theology that centers chaos and war and destruction in the land of Israel, in the holy sites of Jerusalem, as a herald of the end days. And the end days being, basically when the world goes up in flames and those who are saved enjoy the rapture, right? Go to heaven. There is a little window in which a certain number of people, I think that there's actually, some people have a particular number to associate that, but in which you might, join the rapture train, to put it in silly terms. But at that point then, with the end of days, the rest go into their fate and damnation. Okay, so that theology has led people who adhere to that in a very sincere way. And again, polling shows that a significant number of Americans adhere to this theology, right? And what that means is that if there's trouble in Israel, if there's trouble in the Middle East, it's a good thing, because maybe that's a sign that this moment that's been prophesied is going to come. Right? So it kind of gives a boost to saying, these tensions are a good thing rather than a terrible thing, right? This question over here.
Thank you for the lecture. If there was a Super Bowl team for lecturers, you would make the team. I'm from Philadelphia. I wasn't born here, arrived here a few years ago, but I worked in the medical field. I had lots of Jewish friends, and we talked about anti-Semitism all the time. So it is quite real. I can recall times where we had to move a meeting to a different place. I can recall a time where certain people weren't invited to go to a specific lecture or a luncheon. I can recall a time where in one case, this was a town about 50 miles outside of Philadelphia. They wanted to bring in this big deal heart surgeon, but they were faced with the reality that he may, in fact, have to join the country club, and the country club said no. So there were those kind of things. But my question is, you had mentioned that universities and anti-Semitism is sort of misdirected. I wonder if you could explain what's going on recently, and I'm only speaking about Philadelphia and New York and those kind of places, where well-known Jewish business folks who in some cases went to the university, I'll use University of Pennsylvania or Wharton or whatever, who were known donors but held back money because they viewed anti-Semitism at that university. And I think it touched on what you were saying, that they were this was a misguided idea, and maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. First of all, go Eagles. I'm also from Philadelphia, and thank God I'm not on a football team because, man, Eagles would be doing notably less well. Yeah, I mean, what you're pointing to is really important, right? And this is part of what's kind of heightened the discussions of anti-Semitism today, is this notion that anti-Semitism on campuses is just rampant and really threatening and really dangerous. So first of all, it's important to sort of sort out the number of college and university campuses there are in this country versus the number that have been making the news. That goes without saying, right? Elite campuses, ones that are kind of in media centers, tend to get more attention. And they often have a higher population of students who aren't commuters, who might be deeply politically engaged because they're not also working 30 hours a week, all that kind of stuff, right? So often the environment on campuses regarding all kinds of political activism is somewhat different in the elite universities than it is, honestly, than in a place like Iowa, where, you know, there is activism, but not the kind that's going to make the New York Times. Right? What about Jewish donors? And not only, right? There's many Jewish institutions have really condemned administrations of universities for not doing enough against anti-Semitism, right? The Jewish people in the United States aren't unified on this question, right? So when I say a plurality believes that actions that are that are basically saying we're going to cut your funding because you're not doing enough about anti-Semitism, a plurality of Jews says that actually makes anti-Semitism worse. There are, of course, those who feel differently, right? So this is not a unified group. I think there are a couple things going on. One is, again, kind of living in an environment in which you have really absorbed that notion so deeply that anti-Israel speech means anti-Semitic speech. You know, some people just have really absorbed that so deeply. Another is the fact that, as in any ethnic group or social group, there will be people who have different sets of interests, right? Who will have different sets of interests, who will identify with different political strands, right? So there's certainly Jewish people who very much identify with the strand and maybe are professionally invested in the strand for one reason or another. They're fundraisers, right? They're professionally involved with major Jewish institutions, right? They're in spaces where the job, as it's defined, is to kind of fight back against not only anti-Semitism but criticism of Israel, right? And obviously withholding funding is a very powerful way to do that. So I do think that dissent within the Jewish community on this point is part of the story, and it's part of why the situation right now is so incredibly fluid and volatile, because there are very powerful institutions, both Jewish and non-Jewish, saying this is anti-Semitism. And there are also very large numbers of ordinary people, often not involved with the big institutions, saying this is political speech. I don't love it. I actually feel pretty uncomfortable around it, but I'm not going to go to court over it. It's part of walking through the streets of New York, right? So we have to sort of understand that there's going to be a variety of responses. Yeah. In the back.
Hi, you've talked a lot about the protests and how protests against Israel are anti-Semitic.
Could you speak a little more into the mic?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Do you think that there's a way to protest against the genocide that's happening in Israel without being anti-Semitic?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, to me, this is a very simple question, right? To protest genocide and to use that language, if that's what feels true to you, is not being anti-Semitic. If you protest Chinese actions and suppression of the Uyghurs, you are not being ethnically anti-Chinese. You are protesting the actions of a government, very harmful actions of a government. You can do that, right? The difficulty really is when we're too quick to conflate taking strong language against Israel with being anti-Semitic. And I'd say it is really important for us to separate those out. Israel is a state. It has the responsibilities of a state. Judaism is a religion. Jewishness is an ethnicity. It's a culture. It's all kinds of things, okay? And it has to be absolutely possible to have Judaism be a thing, have Israel as a state be a thing, and at the same time understand that historically and today, Israel does have a particular place in Jewish history. Israel is the home to probably soon the majority of the world's Jews, now probably more or less evenly split between the United States and Israel. So, again, just to think of, Chinese ethnicity is connected with China, but it's not synonymous with it, right? So, yeah, I find that actually a thankfully uncomplicated question. Yeah.
We have time for just this one more, I think.
Oh, dear. I'm stuck with the
If
last
you could hold the mic really close to your mouth.
I don't want to be stuck with the last question. Okay.
I'm happy to take a couple more, but I know it also depends on your programming and the library schedule. Okay.
Okay. I appreciate.
We'll keep going till they unplug us.
I appreciate your list from Iowa and how small those things were and how silly they were to be examples of anti-Jewish behavior or thought. But it's a symbol of what we always do. That is, we summarize. We hash things together. We talk about Israel. We don't, every time we say Israel, say the current government of Israel. It's the same thing with the United States. The United States takes this position or that position. The same thing. My rights with the UN are with the way the UN is currently acting, or organizations within the UN, but we never make those distinctions. It's part of trying to exist without carrying around a list that's 7 blocks long all the time.
Okay. First of all, yeah, I mean, it's true. We use, I use the word Zionist and anti-Zionist and say, wait a minute, actually there's a lot of variance within it, but we do use these shorthands, and it's absolutely true that can matter. Using a shorthand, let's say American, without distinguishing between different policies under different governments, could be a problem, right? So, acknowledged. How would I respond to Miller Meeks? This is a more strategic question than anything else. I don't think that Miller Meeks is actually going to listen to me. But I would ask her to tell me exactly what she's talking about. I would say, give me examples. What exactly are you talking about? Give me evidence that the UN is anti-Semitic. And then I would engage those specific things. That would be, like I say, it's more, for me, it's more a strategic question. I'm not going to, again, the UN has been around, we know, for 80 years. Thousands of people are involved with the UN to sort of purport that as an institution is first of all, institutions aren't anti-Semitic, people are anti-Semitic. Institutions don't have brains. But there is obviously, at the very least, a kind of an overgeneralization there, but I would want to dig in a little bit. And then the question of different Jewish denominations, of course, really does matter. And all I'm going to say right now is I'm going to acknowledge it matters, and I'm not going to go into the weeds on that one right now, but hopefully we'll have another conversation. Because I do want to have a chance for just a couple other people to get a question in. Happy to talk to you more about it.
Okay, I'm outvoted, so we're just going to go until they kick us out.
Thank you so much. Not really a question, more of a comment, but I look forward to your response to the comment, is that in the Jewish community, we often struggle with the framing that Jews are the subject of debate without positive inquiry, curiosity, relationship building, right? So like we talk about anti-Semitism, but Judaism is a super wonderful, vibrant, open, exciting, religious, ethnic, cultural civilization that exists globally and here in the United States. And, looking around the room and seeing so many wonderful and lovely people who really want to grapple seriously with this issue, I would just invite you to learn about Judaism. Don't just learn about the people who hate us. Learn about us, our culture, come to services, read a Jewish book. I made challah at the library here yesterday with 20 families. be interested in Jewish cultural production, in Jewish self-identification, in Jewish wisdom, in Jewish knowledge, in Jewish sharing. And, you know, I think that is a much more productive thing that is actually heartwarming and positive that all of us can do, so that we resist the risk of, like, objectification of the Jewish community as a community, but rather say these are our neighbors, these are our friends, we stand with them, we're curious about them, we can talk to them, we can disagree, we can agree, we can learn from them, and we can learn from each other. So I just want to put that out there. Yeah, thank you. I look forward to your response.
Well, we started with a plug for the United Nations Association of Johnson County, and now we're concluding with a plug for Attend Services. I think I just want to go a little meta on that comment, which is say that only engaging the subject of Jews in order to talk about anti-Semitism feeds anti-Semitism. Because it means the only significance Jews have is to be kind of this thorn in the side. Even if you disapprove of anti-Semitism, even if you deplore it, Jews exist only as this problem, right? So I do think there's a kind of a meta level in which saying, listen, one of the things one can do to move away from that framework that Jews only exist as the targets of anti-Semitism, either justly or unjustly, is to have different frameworks for who Jews are, to have different frameworks for what Jewish history is. Jewish history is not just a history of endless persecution, right? It's a very vibrant history. It's a history of cultural innovation and of very radically changing theologies and so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of other stuff going on. And digging into that itself is a way of saying, I'm going to be part of a conversation, and I'm going to make that conversation flourish, that is not simply a conversation about Jews as one way or the other a problem category. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Oh, and we have one more question, which is great.
Oh, thank you so much. In regards to the fundamentalist, very conservative branch of Protestantism, they are in love with the Jews now, in love with Israel now. And I keep reading and hearing about that it really has a dark underbelly. And I think you've perhaps alluded to it, but if you could just say a few words so that I understand that this overwhelming support isn't really that.
Yeah, I mean, what's really hard is sort of moving into the headspace of that framework, right? A framework where you believe that the Bible prophesies that this thing will happen, and you believe it is true, and you believe that this is the brilliant, amazing outcome of history, right? The apocalypse, the end of days, and finally the ascension of all righteous people to heaven. If you deeply believe that, and then there's all kinds of things that are just earthly matters that are part of secular history, but not part of the history that really matters, right? So if there's catastrophe in the land of Israel, if there's catastrophic wars there, that can be almost a footnote to the kind of the sort of sacred history where that framework lives, that the history that matters is the end of days as prophesied, right? So it's really, I mean, and it's not a headspace that I inhabit. I do my best because I think we understand people better. If the closer we can move to understanding them on their own terms, the better off we are. But it's a hard, not just because I find it anti-Semitic, but also because it's just not how I understand history. I understand history as the making of human hands and not the making of God's hands, right? That's how I understand history. The dark underbelly is that all that destruction on earth not only doesn't really matter, but it's necessary and it's desirable, right? in order to reach that end. So yeah, so, and when, in terms of, in practical terms, what the dark underbelly can mean is things like, you know, donating to organizations that support lots of military aid, right? So that's where these kinds of things can then have a very practical implication, right? Then you become part of a kind of religio-political world where your political behavior syncs up with that, and that can lead to sort of political actions that can you know, aggravate real harm in the here and now. Yeah, I mean, by my terms, it's false support. You know, because my terms are, it would be good if there weren't war. It would be good if people were treated with justice and dignity. If your framework is that truth is this particular understanding of revelation, then it's not false. It's a completely different framework. But it's not the one that a liberal democracy founded on the separation of church and state should use as its guiding principles. If you want to have that be your theology, fine. We have all kinds of theologies in the country, right? But that theology should certainly not drive public policy.
Okay.